The spark of change. Sebastian Dixon adjusted his cufflinks as he stepped onto the jet bridge, his weathered hands gripping the handle of his well-worn leather briefcase. At 62, he was a man who carried his wealth with quiet dignity. His salt and pepper hair was neatly trimmed, his dark brown skin bore the marks of wisdom and experience, and his deep-set eyes held the stories of struggles that had forged him into one of the wealthiest businessmen in the world. Unlike most billionaires, Sebastian never flaunted his wealth. He preferred simplicity, dressing in a well-tailored but modest gray suit with no visible brand logos. He had built his empire from the ground up, rising from a childhood of poverty to a life of immense influence. Yet he never lost sight of the values instilled in him by his late grandmother: humility, kindness, and integrity. As he boarded the first-class cabin of the prestigious global airline Aerolux International, he scanned the spacious seating arrangement, nodding politely at the few other passengers already settled into their leather recliners. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had seen it all, yet he carried none of the arrogance that so often accompanied wealth. Finding his seat, Sebastian carefully stowed his briefcase in the overhead compartment and settled in with a sigh of relief. It had been an exhausting week of business meetings and negotiations. Now, all he wanted was a peaceful flight back home. His peace was short-lived. A sharp, authoritative voice interrupted the calm. "Sir, I believe you might be in the wrong section." Sebastian looked up, his eyes meeting those of a flight attendant who stood over him, her expression cold and rigid. She was a striking woman in her late 30s, with immaculately styled auburn hair, a crisp blue uniform, and piercing green eyes that lacked warmth. Her name tag read, Bethany Wells. Sebastian furrowed his brow slightly but kept his composure. "Pardon me?" he asked, his voice steady. Bethany's lips pressed into a thin line. "This is first class, sir," she said, emphasizing the words as if speaking to a child. "Coach is further back." Sebastian let out a soft breath, already sensing where this was going. He had encountered this kind of prejudice before. It never ceased to sting, but he had long since learned to master his emotions. "I assure you, I'm in the correct section," he replied, reaching into his pocket to retrieve his ticket. Bethany hesitated before snatching the ticket from his hand, her fingers grazing his calloused palm with an unmistakable flicker of distaste. She examined the ticket with narrowed eyes, flipping it over as though expecting to find a counterfeit watermark. "Just a moment," she muttered before turning on her heel and marching toward the front of the cabin. Sebastian exhaled slowly, glancing around at the other passengers. A few of them avoided his gaze, uncomfortable with the situation. Others whispered to each other in hushed tones. Minutes passed before Bethany returned, her expression taut with embarrassment. She held out his ticket stiffly. "Your seat is valid," she admitted begrudgingly, though the hostility in her voice remained. Sebastian nodded, taking back the ticket. "Thank you," he said calmly. Bethany lingered for a moment, her mouth twitching as though she wanted to say more. Then, as if determined to regain control of the situation, she folded her arms. "Even so, we do have certain standards in first class," she said icily. "We expect a level of decorum from our passengers." Sebastian's eyes darkened slightly. "I see," he said simply, letting the words hang in the air. Bethany's nostrils flared as she pivoted and walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. The other passengers pretended to be engrossed in their magazines or electronic devices, but Sebastian knew they had all been watching. He sighed, shaking his head slightly. No matter how much money, status, or power you acquired in life, some people would always see you a certain way. 2 minutes later, everything changed. As Sebastian leaned back into his seat, still feeling the sting of the encounter, Bethany suddenly reappeared. Her face was taut, her shoulders squared as she placed a manicured hand on her hip. "Sir," she said in a clipped tone, "I need you to keep your voice down. You're disturbing the other passengers." Sebastian's brows lifted in genuine surprise. "I haven't said a word," he responded, his voice controlled but firm. Bethany pursed her lips. "Well, you're making people uncomfortable," she snapped. "And I will not tolerate unruly behavior in first class." Sebastian inhaled deeply, patience wearing thin. Unruly behavior. His voice remained measured, though his chest tightened with irritation. Bethany stepped closer, lowering her voice but not her hostility. "You're being difficult, sir. If you can't follow our first-class etiquette, I'll have to call security." Sebastian's eyes locked onto hers, cold and unwavering. "Security," he echoed. And then, without warning, her hand lashed out. The slap came so fast that the cabin went utterly silent. A sharp, audible crack filled the air as Bethany's palm met Sebastian's cheek. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The collective gasp from the surrounding passengers sucked the air out of the cabin. Shock rippled through the space like a crashing wave. Sebastian's head barely moved from the impact, but his expression changed. He turned his gaze back to Bethany, slow and measured, his jaw tightening. The fire in her eyes flickered, just for a moment. She realized what she had done. Her hand trembled slightly as she lowered it, her breath coming quicker, her skin paling as she grasped the gravity of her actions. And then, two things happened in quick succession. First, one of the passengers, a businessman in his 50s, grabbed his phone and started recording. Second, Sebastian's phone buzzed. Glancing down, he saw a notification from his legal team. "Acquisition of AEROLUX International is complete. You are now the Billionaire." Sebastian's lips curled into a slow, knowing smile as he looked back at Bethany. She had just struck the new owner of the airline, and in precisely 2 minutes, her world was about to come crashing down. The reckoning begins. Bethany Wells felt her stomach churn as the realization of what she had just done hit her like a tidal wave. Her hand, the very one she had just used to strike a paying passenger. No, not just any passenger, but Sebastian Dixon, still tingled from the contact. The cabin remained eerily silent. Passengers gawked in shock, some covering their mouths, others holding up their phones to capture the aftermath. A few whispered amongst themselves, their hushed tones carrying the weight of disbelief. Bethany's breath hitched. She had made a mistake, a colossal mistake, but she didn't have time to process it. Sebastian Dixon sat still, his composed demeanor unwavering, though his dark brown eyes now held an edge of steel. Slowly, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a silk handkerchief, and dabbed at his cheek. Then he did something Bethany had not expected. He smiled. Not an amused smile, not an angry one, either. It was a knowing smile, a smile that carried power, a smile that sent a jolt of anxiety straight to Bethany's gut. "What? What are you smiling about?" she blurted out before she could stop herself. Sebastian folded the handkerchief neatly before slipping it back into his suit pocket. Then, with the same controlled calm he had exuded all along, he spoke in a voice so smooth and steady that it sent a shiver down her spine. "You'll find out soon enough." The first strike. Before Bethany could make sense of his words, a voice crackled over her earpiece. "Bethany, Captain Holland wants to see you in the cockpit. Immediately." Her heart pounded in her chest. Captain Holland. Why would the pilot want to see her? The lump in her throat tightened as she turned on her heel, marching toward the cockpit doors, her mind racing. As she passed by the other flight attendants, they stared at her, not with their usual camaraderie, but with wariness. They had seen everything. She reached the cockpit, took a deep breath, and knocked. "Enter," came the curt response. Bethany pushed open the door and stepped inside. The captain, a seasoned aviator in his early 60s with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense expression, turned in his seat. His icy blue eyes locked onto her. "Miss Wells," he said, his voice dangerously even. "What the hell just happened out there?" Bethany swallowed hard. "Sir, I saw everything." The words cut her off like a blade. He motioned toward a small monitor displaying a live security feed of the first-class cabin. "You put your hands on a passenger. That is not just a violation of company policy. That's grounds for immediate termination." Bethany felt the blood drain from her face. "Sir, I was provoked," she said, desperation creeping into her voice. He was being. "Stop." Captain Holland's voice was sharp, commanding. He turned to the co-pilot. "Contact corporate. Now." Bethany's breathing grew uneven. "Contact corporate. Do you even know who that man is?" the captain asked, his voice now lower, as if he was still processing the insanity of what had just occurred. Bethany blinked. Did she? Sebastian Dixon. The name rang a bell, but she couldn't quite place it. "He's not just some rich guy," Captain Holland continued, rubbing his temple. "He's Sebastian Dixon, the new owner of Aerolux International." Bethany's stomach plummeted. No, that couldn't be right. The captain exhaled heavily. "You just slapped the man who owns this entire airline." A suffocating silence hung in the cockpit. Bethany's ears rang. It was as though the floor beneath her had crumbled into nothingness. Her fingers curled into fists as panic surged through her veins. "What?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know how you're still standing here, to be honest." Captain Holland shook his head. "Security should be escorting you off this flight the moment we land. If Dixon wants to press charges, you're looking at more than just losing your job, Bethany." Bethany staggered back a step, feeling lightheaded. This was worse, far worse, than she could have imagined. A billionaire. Not just a billionaire. The owner of the company. Her boss's boss's boss. Her entire future hung by a thread. But why hadn't Sebastian already ordered her immediate removal? Why wasn't he making a scene? Bethany turned back to the screen, watching as Sebastian sat there, still calm, still composed, as if he was in complete control. A chilling realization washed over her. He wasn't just waiting to punish her. He was planning something bigger. A storm waiting to break. The rest of the flight was a slow, excruciating countdown to her impending doom. Bethany tried to carry out her duties as if nothing had happened, but the other flight attendants barely spoke to her. Passengers either avoided her or stared at her with barely concealed disgust. Bethany was isolated, abandoned. The power dynamic had shifted, and everyone knew it. She made eye contact with Sebastian only once more before landing, and the smirk he gave her nearly made her legs buckle. By the time the wheels touched down, Bethany's hands were clammy, and a cold sweat trickled down her back. The moment the seatbelt light flicked off, a uniformed airline official stepped onto the plane, his expression grim. "Miss Wells," he called. Bethany felt the blood drain from her face. "Here it comes." She squared her shoulders and turned toward him, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity. "Yes. You're to exit the aircraft first. Mr. Dixon has requested a meeting with you immediately." The final walk. The walk through the terminal felt surreal. Her body moved, but her mind was clouded by a swirling storm of emotions. Bethany had been a flight attendant for over a decade. She had prided herself on her ability to maintain control in any situation. She had faced unruly passengers, emergency landings, and difficult coworkers. But she had never been in a situation like this. She was led through a series of hallways, past glass offices filled with executives and employees who all seemed to know. The whispers followed her like ghosts. Finally, the official stopped in front of a frosted glass door. Bethany's stomach churned. She knew who was on the other side. The official knocked twice before pushing it open. "Miss Wells," the man announced. "Mr. Dixon will see you now." Bethany stepped inside. The door clicked shut behind her. Sebastian Dixon sat behind a sleek, dark oak desk, his hands clasped together. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he studied her, letting her feel the weight of his silence. And then, finally, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Sit down, Miss Wells." Bethany lowered herself into the chair, her fingers gripping the edges of the armrests. Sebastian's dark eyes never left hers. "Tell me, do you understand the gravity of what you've done?" Bethany opened her mouth, then closed it. There were no excuses to make, no words that could erase what had already happened. Sebastian waited, and for the first time in her life, Bethany Wells, the woman who had always controlled every situation, had no control at all. The price of pride. Bethany sat stiffly in the high-backed leather chair, her palms clammy against the armrests. The room was cold, not in temperature, but in atmosphere. The silence was suffocating, thick with tension. Across the desk, Sebastian Dixon, the man she had slapped just hours ago, regarded her with unnerving calm. His hands were steepled, his fingers tapping together as he studied her. He wasn't angry. No, that would have been easier to handle. Instead, he looked amused. And that scared Bethany more than anything. "Miss Wells," he began, his voice smooth and composed. "Do you understand why you're here?" Bethany swallowed hard. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, to insist that she hadn't meant to act out of line. But what could she possibly say? She had slapped the owner of the airline she worked for. There was no excuse for that. She faltered. "I lost my temper." Sebastian's lips twitched slightly, the hint of a smirk playing at the corners. "Yes, that much is obvious. But I'm more interested in why you lost your temper." Bethany's back stiffened. "Because I thought you were trespassing in first class," she admitted, though the words felt weak even as they left her lips. Sebastian arched a brow. "Trespassing?" His voice was laced with amusement. "On a seat I paid for." Bethany clenched her jaw. "I misjudged the situation." Sebastian nodded slowly, as if he were considering her words. Then he leaned back in his chair and let out a slow breath. "You didn't just misjudge the situation, Miss Wells. You misjudged me. And not just me. You've misjudged many passengers before me, haven't you?" Bethany's stomach churned. I treat all passengers according to first-class standards," she said, her voice faltering slightly. Sebastian's smile disappeared. He opened a sleek black folder on his desk and pulled out a stack of papers. "Do you recognize these?" he asked, sliding the documents toward her. Bethany hesitated before picking one up. Her blood ran cold. It was a formal passenger complaint, and not just any complaint. It was about her. Her eyes darted to the next page, and the next, and the next. Dozens of complaints. Each one accused her of mistreating passengers based on race, appearance, or social status. A black businessman had reported that Bethany refused to serve him a second drink while giving another passenger unlimited refills. An elderly Latina woman had written that Bethany ignored her completely while catering to a younger, well-dressed passenger. A Middle Eastern man described how Bethany had made him go through extra security checks on the plane, despite already being cleared. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the damning evidence. Sebastian watched her reaction, his dark eyes calculating. "Your actions weren't just an accident, Miss Wells. They were a pattern." Bethany felt heat rush to her cheeks. I didn't mean." Sebastian held up a hand, silencing her. "Intent is irrelevant. Impact is everything." She gritted her teeth, humiliation clawing at her insides. "So what now?" she snapped, her voice sharp. "Are you firing me?" Sebastian smiled again, but this time it was predatory. "Oh no," he said smoothly. "That would be too easy." Bethany blinked. "What?" Sebastian leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. "If I fire you, you'll leave here blaming me. You'll walk away from this thinking you were the victim. You'll tell yourself it was just one bad moment, one misunderstanding." Bethany's stomach dropped. "But if I keep you," he continued, "I can force you to see yourself." Bethany swallowed. "What do you mean?" Sebastian pushed another document toward her. "You're being reassigned." Bethany's breath caught in her throat as she read the words on the paper. Mandatory MP80 training and cultural society YP program EFFECTY I immediately. She looked up, eyes wide. You want me to go through sensitivity training? Sebastian smiled. Not just any training. You're going to lead it. Bethany gaped at him. What? You heard me, he said calmly. You'll be working with employees from all backgrounds, listening to their stories, training other flight attendants on how to treat passengers with dignity. Bethany felt a burning wave of shame and outrage crash over her. You can't be serious. Sebastian's expression hardened. I am. You need to understand what it feels like to be on the other side. And trust me, by the time I'm done with you, you'll wish I had just fired you. Bethany sat frozen, her entire body tense. Her pride screamed at her to refuse, to walk out, to tell him she wouldn't be humiliated like this. But she couldn't. She needed this job. Her mortgage, her bills, her reputation. Everything was tied to this career. If she walked away now, she wouldn't just lose her job. She'd be blacklisted from the entire airline industry. She clenched her jaw so hard it hurt. And if I refuse? Sebastian tilted his head. Then you're free to leave. But let me remind you, this is your last chance. You won't find another airline willing to hire you after this. Your entire career is on the line. Bethany's breath came in short, uneven bursts. She had spent her entire adult life working her way up the ranks, gaining seniority, earning respect. She was one step away from being promoted to lead flight attendant. And now she was being forced to confront the very thing she had refused to see her entire life. Her own bias. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to calm down. When she opened them again, Sebastian was watching her, waiting. With gritted teeth, she forced out the words, Fine, I'll do it. Sebastian's smirk returned. Good. Your first session starts tomorrow morning. Don't be late. The fall from grace. The next morning, Bethany walked into the airline's corporate training facility with her head held high, but her stomach twisted in knots. Her former colleagues watched her with mixed expressions. Some whispered behind her back. Others openly smirked. She wasn't their superior anymore. She was their lesson. She took her seat at the front of the classroom, alongside other employees attending the mandatory diversity training. But unlike them, she wasn't here to learn. She was here to teach. As the first module began, the instructor turned to her. Bethany, would you like to share why you're here? She wanted to sink into the floor. But then she saw Sebastian standing in the doorway, watching her. She took a shaky breath, clenched her fists beneath the table, and forced herself to speak. My name is Bethany Wells, she said, her voice strained but steady. And I'm here because I need to change. The room went silent. Sebastian nodded slightly. Bethany swallowed. This was just the beginning. And it was going to be hell. The mirror of consequences. Bethany sat at the front of the training room, feeling exposed in a way she never had before. The weight of dozens of eyes pressed against her back. She wasn't standing in the aisles of an airplane, commanding respect in her pristine uniform. No, she was sitting among them. Flight attendants, gate agents, service crew, all here because of her failure. She had spent over a decade in the airline industry, rising through the ranks, earning the title of senior flight attendant. She had perfected the art of crisp professionalism, mastered the subtle air of superiority that came with first-class service. She had cultivated her ability to command obedience from passengers, ensuring they adhered to the unwritten expectations of the elite cabin. But today, she wasn't in control. She was on display. The training facilitator, a middle-aged woman with warm brown skin and piercing hazel eyes, cleared her throat. Bethany, thank you for introducing yourself. Since you're leading today's session, perhaps you'd like to begin by sharing why you're here. Bethany felt her entire body tense. She glanced toward the doorway, where Sebastian Dixon stood, arms folded, watching. She clenched her jaw. This was his plan. Not to fire her, not to let her leave with the comforting delusion that she had been unfairly dismissed. No, he wanted her to face herself, to stand in front of her peers, the very people she had looked down on, and admit that she had been part of the problem. Bethany's fingers curled into her palms as she forced out the words, "I'm here because I made a mistake." The words burned her throat. The silence in the room deepened. Some of the employees leaned forward, eyes sharp with scrutiny, as if waiting for her to spin a version of the story that would make her look better. Bethany forced herself to hold their gazes. She wouldn't make excuses. Not this time. "I discriminated against a passenger. I made assumptions about him based on how he looked, and I let my biases influence my actions. Because of that, I hurt someone who didn't deserve it." A few people exchanged glances. Some nodded slightly. Others remained stone-faced. Bethany swallowed. She had always been in a position of authority, dictating the terms of her interactions. But here, she was the lesson, the warning of what not to do. The facilitator, Minna Caldwell, observed her with an unreadable expression. "And what was the consequence of that mistake, Bethany?" Bethany's lips pressed together. "I was reassigned. And now I have to complete this training as part of my disciplinary action." Minna tilted her head slightly. "I see." Then, after a brief pause, she asked the question Bethany had been dreading. "Do you believe you deserve to be fired?" Bethany stiffened. The entire room seemed to lean in. Sebastian, still standing by the door, raised an eyebrow. Bethany inhaled sharply. The old Bethany would have immediately said no. She would have doubled down, justified herself, insisted that it was an honest mistake or that she was just doing her job. But the truth had been staring her in the face since the moment Sebastian sat down in first class. "Yes," she admitted, voice quiet but firm. "I deserve to be fired." The words felt like a confession. Minna nodded thoughtfully. "And yet, you're still here." Bethany's eyes flickered to Sebastian. "Because someone gave me another chance." The first lesson. The next few hours of training were brutal. It wasn't just textbook definitions of discrimination or corporate-approved guidelines. It was real stories. Stories from employees who had been humiliated and overlooked because of their race, gender, or background. A black flight attendant shared how she was constantly mistaken for a cleaning staff member in airport lounges. A Latina gate agent described passengers refusing to speak to her in English, assuming she wouldn't understand them. A South Asian customer service representative recounted the number of times people mocked her accent, even though she was born and raised in the U.S. Each story tightened the noose around Bethany's conscience, because she had been one of those people. Not openly, not aggressively, but in small, subtle ways. The polite dismissal of a request. The extra layer of scrutiny when someone didn't look right for first class. The unconscious belief that some people just didn't belong. And now she had to sit here, listen, and own up to it. She felt like she was drowning in her own guilt. Halfway through the session, Minna called for a break, and Bethany practically bolted from the room, heading straight for the nearest restroom. She leaned against the sink, gripping the cool porcelain as she stared at her reflection. Her composed exterior was beginning to crack. Her pride was shattered. She squeezed her eyes shut. Who the hell even am I? The sound of the restroom door opening jolted her back to reality. She turned, expecting another employee. Instead, Sebastian Dixon stood in the doorway. Bethany's breath hitched. He said nothing at first, stepping inside and leaning against the wall, arms crossed. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Then, Sebastian broke the silence. "Hurts, doesn't it?" Bethany swallowed hard. "What?" "Looking at yourself," he said, his voice softer than before. "Seeing everything you thought was normal through someone else's eyes." Bethany gritted her teeth. "I get it. Okay. I was wrong." Sebastian exhaled slowly. Acknowledging the problem is the first step. But fixing it, That takes real work. He straightened. And whether you realize it or not, Bethany, this isn't just about you. It's about every single person like you who doesn't see the problem until it's staring them in the face. Bethany felt something sting behind her eyes. She looked away. I don't know if I can change, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Sebastian studied her for a moment. You already have, he said simply. You just don't believe it yet. With that, he turned and walked out, leaving her alone with her reflection. For the first time in her life, Bethany saw herself for who she truly was. Not a victim. Not a leader. Not someone who had simply made a mistake. She was the product of a system that had failed people like Sebastian. And now, she had a choice. She could fight it, or she could fix it. The breaking point. Bethany stared at her reflection in the restroom mirror, her breath shallow. For the first time in her life, she felt small. Not because of her title or position, but because she had finally been forced to confront something she never wanted to see herself. The woman staring back at her wasn't just a flight attendant with seniority. She was someone who had spent years looking through people instead of at them. Someone who had dismissed passengers who didn't fit her expectations. Someone who had allowed her biases to define her actions. And now, Sebastian Dixon had cracked open her carefully constructed world, and she had no choice but to look at what was inside. She gripped the sink tighter, her fingers digging into the cool porcelain as memories flooded back. The time she had ignored an elderly black man asking for assistance with his luggage, assuming he wasn't her problem. The time she had subtly monitored a Middle Eastern passenger longer than necessary after hearing another passenger whisper a racist stereotype. The way she smiled more warmly at first-class passengers who looked the part. White, well-dressed, familiar. She squeezed her eyes shut. She had never considered herself racist. She wasn't one of those people. At least, that's what she had always told herself. But if that were true, then why had she assumed Sebastian didn't belong? Why had she slapped him? Because she wanted control. And when he didn't comply, when he had the audacity to push back, she lashed out. Her stomach twisted. God, what if someone had done that to her? She gripped the sink harder, her knuckles turning white. Is this what it feels like? To be reduced to a stereotype. To be treated as if you don't belong somewhere that you earned the right to be in. To be overlooked, doubted, dismissed, not because of what you did, but because of what someone assumed about you. Bethany suddenly felt sick. The next test. When she returned to the training room, the atmosphere had shifted. Everyone knew she had been struggling. They had seen her storm out. They had seen Sebastian follow. And now, they were watching her more carefully. She didn't need their pity, but she hated their judgment. Mina, the training facilitator, glanced at her as she took her seat. Welcome back, Bethany, she said gently, before addressing the group. Let's move on to today's exercise. Bethany stiffened. Exercise. Mina gestured toward a whiteboard at the front of the room, where two categories had been written: prejudice and bias. Each of you will write down a personal experience where you were either affected by bias or have been guilty of prejudice yourself, Mina explained. No names, just the experience. A murmur swept through the room. Bethany's heart hammered in her chest. Was this another test? A subtle way to make her expose herself? One by one, employees stood, walked up to the board, and wrote their experiences down on sticky notes before silently placing them in the respective categories. Bethany clenched her fists under the table. She could feel Sebastian's eyes on her, could feel the weight of expectation pressing against her ribs. This was it, the moment where she had to make a choice. Did she pretend, write something shallow, something meaningless just to get through the exercise? Or did she own it? The damage. The harm. The truth. Bethany inhaled sharply, stood, and walked to the board. Every step felt heavier than the last. She grabbed a sticky note, clicked open a pen, and wrote the only truth that mattered. I slapped a passenger because I didn't think he belonged in first class. I assumed his place based on the color of his skin, and I let my prejudice dictate my actions. I was wrong." She stared at the words, her heart thundering. She didn't just admit it to herself. She had written it for everyone to see. She placed the note under prejudice. Then she turned and walked back to her seat. Silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. She refused to look at anyone. Refused to see the judgment, the sympathy, the whispers. She stared at the table, her breath uneven. And then, the unexpected happened. A voice spoke. "I judged a passenger because of their accent. I assumed they were difficult before I even listened to them." Bethany's eyes snapped up. It was another flight attendant, a white man who had been in the industry just as long as she had. He placed his note under prejudice. Then another voice. "I watched another flight attendant treat a black passenger differently, and I didn't say anything. I regret it." Another note. Then another. And another. Within minutes, the board was filled. Bethany stared at it, her throat tightening. She wasn't the only one. She wasn't the only one. Mina smiled, stepping forward. "Bias exists in all of us," she said. "Prejudice is learned. But accountability, that's a choice." Bethany clenched her jaw, her eyes burning. For the first time in days, she felt something shift inside her. The wall she had built, the one that made excuses, the one that justified her actions, the one that kept her from seeing herself, was crumbling. Piece by piece, brick by brick. And for the first time, she wanted it to fall. After the session, when the training ended, Bethany lingered in the empty room, staring at the whiteboard filled with confessions. Sebastian stood by the door, watching her. "You didn't have to do that," he said. Bethany exhaled. "Yes, I did." He nodded slowly. "And?" Bethany swallowed hard, finally turning to meet his gaze. "It hurts," she admitted. "It hurts to see what I've done. To know that I was part of the problem. To know that people saw me as that person." Sebastian studied her carefully. "And what are you going to do about it?" Bethany let out a shaky breath. She didn't have an easy answer. Because words weren't enough. She had to do better. Be better. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't just saying it to save herself. She was saying it because she meant it. Redemption or ruin. Bethany Wells walked out of the training room that day feeling like a stranger in her own skin. For years, she had moved through life unquestioned, unchallenged, untouched by the weight of her own actions. She had believed she was good at her job, that she upheld high standards, that she deserved the respect she demanded from her crew and passengers alike. But now she knew the truth. She had spent years mistaking prejudice for professionalism, and now she had two choices: change or be destroyed by what she had done. The flight of reckoning. 2 days later, Bethany reported to her first flight since the training session. Everything felt different. Her uniform, once a source of pride, felt heavy on her shoulders. Her name tag, once a symbol of authority, now felt like a reminder of her past mistakes. Her crew, once her equals, now seemed to see through her. As she entered the airport terminal, she could feel the whispers following her. "That's her. I heard she almost got fired. She slapped a passenger, and they let her keep her job." Bethany kept walking. She didn't snap at the gossip. She didn't deny the rumors. She had earned every whisper. Her first flight back would be a test. And she knew it. As she stepped into the first-class cabin, she saw familiar faces among the crew. Some of them had been there that day, the day she lost control. Their eyes lingered on her, waiting to see what kind of flight attendant she was now. Bethany took a breath. This was it, the moment where she would either rise or fall. A different Bethany. Passengers began boarding, and Bethany immediately noticed a difference in herself. She saw things she had never noticed before. A black father with his young daughter, both of them hesitating as they reached first class, as if expecting to be questioned about whether they belonged. A Middle Eastern woman clutching her boarding pass tightly, her knuckles white. An elderly Latino man struggling to place his bag in the overhead bin, his eyes darting around, waiting for someone to help or ignore him. The old Bethany would have been blind to these things. But now she saw everything, and she knew that what she did next would define her future. She moved. Bethany stepped toward the elderly man before he even had to ask. "Let me help you with that, sir," she said, her voice gentler than it had ever been. She lifted the suitcase with ease, securing it into the bin. The man blinked, then smiled. A genuine, grateful smile. "Thank you, young lady." She nodded. "Of course." Next, she approached the father and his daughter. "Good evening, sir. Would your daughter like a pillow or blanket before takeoff?" The father looked surprised. "Oh, yes, that would be great. Thank you." Bethany crouched slightly to meet the little girl's eyes. "And if you need anything during the flight, just press this button." "Okay." The little girl nodded, a shy smile forming. Bethany straightened just as the Middle Eastern woman reached her row. Bethany smiled warmly, making eye contact, something she had avoided in the past. "Welcome aboard, ma'am. I hope you enjoy your flight." The woman visibly relaxed. Bethany felt it. The difference. She wasn't just doing a job. She was making a choice. A choice to be better. A choice to be aware. A choice to see people as people. And for the first time in her career, she felt worthy of her title. The passenger who changed everything. Just as Bethany was beginning to settle into her new reality, she felt her stomach drop. Because he had just boarded. Sebastian Dixon. She knew he was coming. He always flew on this route, but seeing him now, stepping into the first-class cabin with his quiet power and unreadable expression, made her hands tremble. She was not ready for this. Sebastian stopped at his seat and glanced at her. Their eyes met. Bethany's breath caught. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Bethany moved forward. "Good evening, Mr. Dixon," she said, her voice steady. "Welcome aboard." Sebastian studied her carefully, as if searching for any trace of the woman who had once slapped him. Bethany held his gaze. Finally, Sebastian's lips curled slightly. "Good evening, Miss Wells." A beat of silence passed. Then, to her utter shock, Sebastian extended his hand. Bethany stared at it. A test. A choice. Slowly, she reached out and shook it. His grip was firm but unthreatening. A message. "We are not finished, but you're on the right path." Bethany nodded once, then stepped back. "Let me know if you need anything, sir." Sebastian's lips twitched again. "I will." She turned and walked away, her heart pounding. This wasn't over. But it was a start. A new reputation. The flight went smoother than any she had ever worked. Not because it was easy, but because she was different. By the time they landed, she noticed something even more shocking. Her crew, the ones who had been watching her, doubting her, were now nodding at her in approval. No one said it outright, but she saw it in their faces. Respect. Not the kind of fear-based respect she used to demand. The kind of respect you earn when you take responsibility for your actions. When the passengers disembarked, Sebastian was the last to leave. He stopped near the door, turning to her. "Miss Wells." Bethany straightened. "Mr. Dixon." He studied her, then said, "Keep going." Bethany's chest tightened. It wasn't praise. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a challenge. And this time, she was ready for it. The final test. Bethany Wells stood in the dimly lit corridor of the Aerolux headquarters, her heart pounding like a war drum in her chest. The weight of her transformation sat heavy on her shoulders. It had been 3 months since the day she had slapped Sebastian Dixon. 3 months since her entire career had nearly ended in disgrace. 3 months since she had begun the most difficult journey of her life. A journey toward confronting the woman she had been and fighting to become someone better. And now, it all came down to this. The final test. She exhaled, squaring her shoulders as she pushed open the large glass doors to the conference room, where Sebastian Dixon was waiting for her, the offer that would change everything. The room was silent except for the ticking of the sleek, modern clock on the wall. Sebastian sat at the head of a long mahogany table, dressed in an impeccably tailored dark navy suit, his presence commanding yet utterly calm. To his left sat Mina Caldwell, the training facilitator who had helped guide Bethany through the most humiliating and eye-opening period of her life. To his right, two board executives, both high-ranking officials within Aerolux International, watched her with unreadable expressions. Bethany swallowed. This was no ordinary meeting. Something was happening here. Sebastian gestured toward an empty chair across from him. "Miss Wells," he said smoothly, "have a seat." Bethany hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward and lowering herself into the chair, folding her hands in her lap to keep them from shaking. Sebastian studied her for a long, unsettling moment. Then he finally spoke. "You've changed." Bethany's breath hitched slightly. She hadn't expected that. Not praise, not outright approval, just a simple statement of fact. Sebastian leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "When I first met you, you were..." He paused, searching for the right word. "Unaware." Bethany flinched. Not cruel, not accusatory, but true. "You operated under assumptions," Sebastian continued, "most of them ingrained in you by years of experience in an industry that has long upheld certain unspoken rules about who does and doesn't belong in first class." Bethany clenched her jaw, nodding slightly. She would have argued before. Now she knew better. Sebastian tapped his fingers together. "You could have walked away. You could have taken the easy route and left the airline, blaming me, blaming the system, blaming anyone but yourself." Bethany met his gaze. "I wanted to, at first," she admitted honestly. Sebastian's lips twitched slightly. "I know." He sat back in his chair. "But you didn't." Bethany exhaled slowly. "No," she said quietly. "I didn't." Sebastian exchanged a brief glance with Mina Caldwell before reaching into a leather folder and sliding a document across the table toward her. Bethany's stomach dropped. Her name was printed at the top. Her heart pounded as she read the title beneath it. Director of Diversity and Inclusion, Aerolux International. Her hands trembled as she looked up at him in pure shock. "You're offering me a job?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sebastian nodded. "Not just a job. A mission." Bethany's mouth went dry. "Why?" Sebastian's dark eyes studied her. "Because redemption means nothing if you don't do something with it." Bethany blinked. "You've done the work," Sebastian continued. "You've seen the problem from both sides. Now, I'm giving you the opportunity to make sure this airline, our airline, never lets it happen again." Bethany stared at him. This wasn't just for show. This wasn't punishment. This was trust. Sebastian trusted her to take the worst moment of her life and turn it into something that mattered. Bethany exhaled, her eyes burning. She had spent so many years believing she already knew everything there was to know about the airline industry. But now she knew the truth. She had only just begun to understand. The road ahead. 1 week later, Bethany walked into the Aerolux headquarters, not as a disgraced flight attendant, but as the newly appointed Director of Diversity and Inclusion. The first order of business, a full-scale overhaul of hiring practices, training programs, and accountability measures. New policies to protect passengers and employees from discrimination. Mandatory training for all Aerolux staff, starting at the top. It wouldn't be easy. She would face doubt, pushback, resistance from those who didn't believe change was necessary. But Bethany was no longer the person who flinched away from hard truths. She had earned her second chance, and she would make damn sure she wasn't the only one who got one. The final flight. 1 month later, Bethany boarded an Aerolux flight, not as a flight attendant, but as an observer. Her first major training session was scheduled for the next morning. She found her seat in business class and settled in, watching the cabin crew move efficiently through their pre-flight checks. Then she sensed him. Sebastian Dixon. He slid into the seat across from her, adjusting his cufflinks before meeting her gaze with a smirk. "Didn't think you'd get rid of me that easily, did you?" he asked. Bethany chuckled, shaking her head. Not for a second. A beat of silence passed. Then Sebastian said something that made her pause completely. "You're going to make mistakes," he told her. "You're going to have moments where you think you haven't changed at all. Moments where you slip into old habits. It's inevitable." Bethany swallowed. "I know." Sebastian leaned back, watching her. "And when that happens, you have to do what you did that day in training." Bethany frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Sebastian smiled. "You have to own it. Then fix it. Then keep going." Bethany let the words settle in her chest. She had thought this journey was about reaching a finish line. But there was no finish line. Only the next step. And the next. And the next. She looked out the window as the plane began to taxi, the sky stretching wide and open before her. Bethany Wells wasn't the same woman she had been 3 months ago. She was better. Not perfect. Not fixed. But better. And for the first time in her life, that was enough. The engines roared, and the plane lifted off the ground. Bethany smiled. This was just the beginning.